Game 10 of the World Championship match between Magnus Carlsen and Nepomniachtchi. Magnus is white and he's leading by 3 points, so all he needs is just 2 more draws and he's gonna be the world champion one more time. So he plays e4 and Nepo goes for e5, knight f3, knight f6. I would criticize this choice of opening because the Petrov defense is known to be a defense where white can easily trade queens early in the game and steer the game towards a draw if he wants to. So Nepo should have chosen something like the Sicilian where there is no early trade of queens and hope for a long game. But as this game shows, he was not really in the mood for a fight, and his play in this game shows. So e5, knight f6, knight takes, d6 and knight d3 from Carlsen, which is a line that he played against Caruana, which leads to an endgame pretty quickly. Take and queen e2, forcing queen e7, defending this knight, and now knight f4, he's threatening knight to d5. And now Caruana had seen this in his match against Carlsen and played knight c6. After knight d5, knight d4 takes. The game was soon equal and it was drawn. By the way, there's a nice trick in this position. If white, let's say, plays queen c4, saying, hey, I'm going to attack your queen, I'm also going to attack this pawn with check. And what are you going to do? Well, what he's going to do is knight c3, check, discovered check. And once you take, there's a cute little mate on c2. Well, obviously, that was not going to happen in this game, because Jan did not play knight c6, he played knight f6, and now he's offering a trade of queens. Something that he should have done earlier in the match, where he instead tried to not offer a trade of queens and then ended up losing that game. So anyway, now he seems to have learned the lesson a little too late, I guess. But d4 and knight c6. And now here it's an interesting moment, because Magnus, if he wanted to fight for a complex middle game, would have played the move bishop to e3, preventing a trade of queens, and a sample line can go like this: bishop f5, knight c3, long castle, d5, creating an imbalance, knight e5 and long castle. And by no means is this a clear position. White, I think, has the better structure here, and black's king is far more loose than white's king. The game is not over by any means, but Magnus, if he really wanted a fight, could have played like this. Instead, he realized that it was in his best interest to avoid these complications and take a draw if he could get one without a problem, because then he still keeps his 3-game advantage and there's only 4 more games left for Nepo to score 3 wins, which against Magnus is practically impossible. So he played the safe move, pawn to c3, after close to 20 minutes of thought. And Nepo played pawn to d5. Knight d2. Knight d8. He's trying to reroute this knight to e6. And Magnus played knight f3, saying, okay, you can play knight e6. I'm willing to play for a middle game if I can get a fairly reasonable position. And I think this was Nepo's chance to go for it, because if knight e6, yes, white can play knight e5 and he can have a smooth position. But after a move like c6, it's not immediately obvious how white's breaking through or getting any serious advantage. And black keeps the queens on the board and chances for some dynamic play. But that was not to be. Nepo traded queens, which is pretty much an admission that, hey, I don't have many ambitions to win this game, so let me just draw this one and get it out of my way, which really led to a pretty boring game. Bishop takes, bishop d6, castles. Now Magnus improves with bishop d3. Rook e8, rook e1, trades. Pieces are just coming off the board. It's pretty clear that Nepo's not got any ambitions, and maybe he's saying to Magnus, okay, if you don't have ambitions to win with white, I can only hope to draw with black. But he could have played, for example, b6 in this position, and h3, c5, and avoided another trade of pieces, and maybe try to create some complications here. But instead he played knight e6, offering another trade. Well, Magnus says thank you, takes. And now Magnus played this nice move g3, which prepares to move this knight to g2 and bring his bishop to f4, trade off that guy, and then he'll have a comfortable position. So g6 and knight g2 and rook e8, f3 first from Magnus, pretty nice point. Now he's covered the g4 and e4 squares. His king is ready to come up here and safeguard his position, and then he can take his time and trade this dark squared bishop and have a comfortable position in the endgame. So knight h5, but king to f2, no problem, and pawn to c6. g4 from Magnus pushes him back, and finally he's ready to play bishop to f4 and trade off this guy. And here's already a critical moment, because Magnus has achieved a slight advantage, I would say, because his knight is far better placed than that guy. He's got the better bishop compared to that one. So black has to be careful, or Magnus will slowly tighten the screws in this type of position, and it could go terribly wrong for black. So he responded correctly with g5, hitting this knight immediately. Let's say what happens if, for example, a6. Then white can prevent g5 with h4. And now his knight is here solidly, for at least for a moment. And now let's say black recognizes his mistake and plays h6. But then white can utilize something like this to play b4, g5, take, and f3, f6, and a4, and start play on this side. So he reacted correctly with g5, stopping h4, and after knight e2, played f5. So he's creating some play here, and Magnus holds this pawn with h3. Now ideally he'd love to make it more complicated with h5, but unfortunately after take and rook g1, that pawn is pinned to the king and it's lost. So he had to prepare that with king to f7. And now Magnus could have played rook g1, so that h5 is prevented anyway with g takes, and we have the same problem. Instead he played a slightly aggressive move with rook to h1, because after h5 his point was he could play h4. And now if let's say if hg4, that's not so good, because h takes g5, g takes f3, and knight f4, and white has an extremely dominant position. If h4, if fg4, then hg5, excuse me, and black can equalize with bishop f5, knight f4, take, and even though white gets knight e5 check and king here and takes, the engines think that white doesn't have any significant advantage in this position. So instead, Nepo played h6, he played it solid, but now Magnus played f4. And he's more than willing to simplify the position and get a draw himself, because he's had enough. And now let's say if he had played g takes f4, then knight takes f4, and this knight is really strong on f4, and it's already a slight advantage for white. And let's assume that he tried to stay in the position with a move like bishop d7, and he was perhaps afraid of this interesting maneuver with knight g1, because after takes, knight comes to f3, now he's going to e5, and that's going to be a big problem. Black has to sacrifice the exchange with take, bishop takes, knight e5 check, hitting this guy, so he has to give up the rook and then play h5. And this is unclear, because black does have compensation for the exchange. But nevertheless, it doesn't look like it's black who is playing for the win here. If anyone, it's white who is playing for the win in this position. So Nepo had nothing of that. He took the guy, and Magnus took it back. He took on g4, Magnus took h6. And now he was just in time to play bishop to f5, hitting this guy and equalizing the game completely, because takes, and check, but simply blocks the check and temporarily loses this pawn, but king g6 and picks up the pawn again. And now here it's an important psychological moment because rook g3 check was played by Magnus, king f6, rook f3, king e7, and now Magnus could have played rook e3, saying, okay, I'm ready to trade rooks and let's agree to a draw. Instead, Magnus played knight to f4, saying to Nepomniachtchi, well, I can still play for a win because I'm the world champion and I don't need to play for draws. And I think this is a more than a move, it's a psychological statement saying, yes, a draw is good for me, but I'm not afraid to fight it against you if I want to. And so knight f4 saying, okay, you can keep your rook on the board. I'm the one playing for a win here. So Nepo had to find accurate moves here. King d6, knight g6. He's coming to e5, but no problem. Rook e6, attacking the knight. So knight e5 and now knight e8 equalizes because after rook f7, he finally trades rooks, and the game is drawn after king to e3. And obviously there's no reason to continue from here. One thing that you would normally not do in such a position is to play something like knight d7 and trade knights, because generally speaking these kind of end games are quite dangerous if white manages to get ahead and get some sort of opposition. Now in this case, black can just hold the line and be safe like this, but normally you would not want to get yourself in this position, and black can actually avoid all of that and just play a move like knight to e4, and this king is never getting in, and there's no way for white's knight to make any progress. So the game was drawn in this position. So only 4 games left, and Nepo has to win 3 of them, which make his chances look pretty bleak in this World Championship match.